Father in heaven, we ask for the blessing of your word, of blessing of your spirit as we open your word. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Okay, so we were looking at fractals, prophetic fractals as methodology, and just by way of recap, we rehashed the concept that a fractal is a pattern. How do we define it? A sequence that repeats within itself at a different scale, right? So we have what we identified as a parent line or a macro line, right? And from this line, we draw our fractals. And we use the parable of the 10 virgins as an illustration, where we saw that the parable itself, the parable, the symbolic representation presents a model. Yes. So we have our model, which shows virgins arising, taking their lamps, going forth. They meet with a tarrying time. There's a cry at midnight and then the shut door. This is the specifications of the model. Yes. And what are we required to do when we study a parable? In order to understand what a parable means for our time, we really break down the model, study the model, understand its specifications, right? And once you've understood that, you can begin to make application of the model, right? Now, with a lot of these parables, a lot of these models, Ellen White makes applications for you. Some of them, with some of these parables, you can derive, let me continue down the line. With this parable, Ellen White makes applications, right? And there's more than one application of the parable that she makes. There is this one here, where she's taking the line of progression, the big picture of Adventist history. She identifies the time period intervening between October 22nd, 1844 and Christ's second coming, in different ways and in different passages, but she identifies this as the tarrying time. Right? She identifies it as the tarrying time. You can also, yes. So based on that, we construct this line of the 10 virgins, right, around this representation of the tarrying time. We construct this application around this representation of the tarrying time, which is the parable as it is applied to the history of the final church. She also makes this application in Great Controversy, where it applies more specifically to Millerite history. Now, maybe one of the points at which we were wrestling was the idea that this Millerite line, it is both an application of the model, it's an application of the model, but it is also a fractal of this application of the model. Does that make sense? Though I think there was a bit of wrestling around that, because we did not arrive at the Millerite line by fractalizing this line. We did not arrive at the Millerite line by fractalizing this line. We arrived at the Millerite line by looking at how she applied the model. We arrived at the Millerite line directly. We arrived at the Millerite line directly from here. This was not a step that we made, right? But we're saying that as we understand parable teaching, how we're to parable methodology and what is the correct way to go about it, it's important to identify the big picture, to identify a macro line, where there is one, and then draw any local fractals from that macro application, right? So it's a bit of, is the expression reverse engineering that we're doing? Remember when I say reverse engineering, right? You have the end product, which is, say, the Millerite line. And then you may not know all the steps as to how that product was constructed. Now you're going back step by step to establish how you arrive from your beginning point to that end product, right? It's called reverse engineering. You know, like the Iranians, an American drone would crash, right? An American military drone would crash in Iran. They have the complete product. They don't know how it's made, right? But they begin with that complete product and begin to deconstruct, right? Start to break apart its pieces and begin to start to deconstruct how it was constructed, sort of like working backwards. Does that make sense? Right, so here we went direct from here to here, and that's what we've always done, based on how Ellen White presents this history. But properly, we should, from here, identify a macro line, a big picture, right? And then, as we lay out the big picture, the Millerite line becomes a fractal of the macro line. Does that make sense? Why is that important? What benefit is gained by taking this extra step? Do you have any thoughts? What benefit is gained by taking this extra step? It's not just for happenstance, that it's nice to do. What's the benefit, profit by it?
Well, to have an angle on how this history is playing out.
To have an angle
on how this history is playing out.
How the history?
Because I'm thinking, of the template that we usually use, for the Millerite line, which is a different. So I would have, in using the 10 version line, I may have more details that I would have not seen if I had taken, the regular template.
Okay. You're saying you could glean more details from this than you would from just looking at that. Is that what you're saying?
Glean more details on, if I compare it, for example, from the GC line, not the one down there.
Okay.
This one, because I know this one, but now that I have this one, maybe there's more information that I can get that will come, to help me to better understand the other one.
Okay. Well, I don't think this line of the 10 virgins will necessarily help you understand this line of great controversy. What I think is this, that you have these are two different models, yes? And you have the history. You have this history from 1798 to the Second Coming, right? Now, each of these models are giving greater insight on this history. Not that because you understand the 10 virgins model, right? You therefore better understand the great controversy model, but each of these models, in distinction from one another, are feeding information and understanding on this history. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's just like filling in a picture of a puzzle. So you gotta.
Should I say that again?
So, for example, I have 1844, on both models.
Yes. I'm listening.
What will be the difference? Because if I use a second model, it's because it's going to give me another, it's going to give me adding information from another model. For example, when we were reading about 1844, we saw that it was a tiring time.
Okay.
But it's not a tiring time, on this model there.
Yes. So I guess the thing is that there's a tiring time here. Does that mean you must see a tiring time here?
No.
No. That's not what this model is bringing out.
Right.
But that there's a tearing time here. It tells you something about this history here, that 1844 is a tearing time. Yes. This model may bring out different points about 1844. Let's do this, for example. Right. Where's the blue pen? Okay, so this model teaches that 1844 is the tearing time. The 10 versions teaches that 1844 is the tearing time. Okay. And the GC model, what can we place about 1844?
Shut door.
Or it's emphasizing, say, change of administration, sanctuary. Input sanctuary here. Right? So because you have in the 10 virgins model, 1844 is the tearing time. Must you see the tearing time here? No. And because here the sanctuary, the development of the sanctuary in 1844 is being brought up, must we have to see it here?
No, because that's not the subject.
It's not the model. But both these models are presenting the same waymark, but they bring out different aspects of that waymark. And what are they teaching about? Not so that they influence each other, but they're teaching about the history. So when we come to 1844 here, we can see on one level, you know, it's the tarrying time. And we can see on one level, you know, there's the developments with the sanctuary taking place. These models are illuminating this history, but as we interpret the models themselves, there's no combining of the two models that should take place. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Have I lost anyone? Debray, you look lost.
I should be. Yeah.
You what?
So if you could re-explain the last time when you put the TT and the sanctuary at 1844 at the bottom.
Can I say something?
Yes.
I think the arrows coming down, is that confusing you? He's just saying you pull that whole thing down. You're pulling the whole things down. But one line is teaching you the,
There's different aspects.
yeah.
Oh,
You see what I'm
yeah.
saying? Yeah. Okay. Because it was confusing me.
It's confusing you too?
No, it was just the arrows. It just seemed like those boxes, but you mean the whole.
Yeah. Okay. The only point I've tried to make here is how these models relate to one another, because we keep falling into this state of wanting to see why isn't, like here, 1840s here, and then we'll want to see it here. Why isn't 1844 here, right? Questions like that keep coming up. You know what I mean? And we need to come to a place where we're not threatened by the fact that 1844 is in this model and it's not in this one, because we understand that we're just taking what the parable is giving us. We're taking the waymarks the parable is presenting. And each parable presents the same history, 1798 to the second coming in this context, through different lenses. It's emphasizing different things. So we must break out of this habit of wanting to see, you know, details of other parables or other lines in a given line that we're looking at, if that makes sense. Right? We just take what is presented, understand it, and apply it to our time. We take what is presented, understand it, and apply it to our time where it fits, and not try to add in things that are not being presented. Maybe I've not done a very good job of explaining that. I hope you understand. You know. Okay, so yeah, we made the point that it's important to lay out the, you know, to identify a macro line or a line of progression from which you derive your fractals. Why is this important? I'll answer my own question. Because when you have this line as a, I'll avoid using the word, when you have this line on which to base this one, you can have more confidence in your interpretation or application of what you're seeing at this line. You have another witness, right? Rather than coming from here to here, you can be confident in your conclusions. But when you have a macro line and you're drawing the same pattern from a macro line, usually as it is presented to you in inspiration, and that becomes the basis of your fractal application, you can have more confidence in the soundness of that fractal application because you have more than one witness for it. Alison?
Yes, I agree.
Don't just agree. Did you get it?
No.
Where did I lose you?
I don't know.
I lost you everywhere.
Yeah. I wasn't paying attention, sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Okay.
I have one question.
Yes.
These lines we're familiar with for many years. And now we're looking at them through the parables that we've been understanding over the last couple of years.
Yes.
And none of this is the old methodology from before.
Well, this is, when you say old methodology, not all of it was wrong.
Yeah.
We're refining how we approach line upon line. Because line upon line is old methodology. We've been doing line upon line since '89. But we're refining how we understand it.
So I just want to make sure that I'm not following anything from before. This has always been my thought. That could be error. You know?
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's unrefined. I mean, I trust what you've been putting the board. I mean, I've missed the whole week, so I'm coming in and I see what you got up there. It's common sense. It's what I understand from before.
But do you get my point? That rather than just coming, what do we want to do right away? When we look at a parable, where do we want to go instantly?
Original.
That's not where we usually want to go instantly.
We want to go to the place that gives us the most information.
We want to go from the model straight to the priest.
Yeah.
In the fractal,
Yes, want to fractalize right away.
right? And
Want to take everything from the model straight to the, am I correct?
Yeah.
Am I correct, Joe?
Yeah, that's the habit that people have.
That's the habit.
It's got them in trouble.
That's the habit that's gotten us in trouble, right? So now, as we add an extra layer, that's what we're doing. We're adding an extra layer, right? Of identifying the macro line, the line of progression, or the big line. And using that also as a template for how we understand our fractal, right? We can have greater confidence. It will guide us to more sound conclusions about how to understand our fractal line. Does that make sense? So we need to resist the urge to go straight, saying, where do we put this in the line of the priest? And begin to think more about, spend more time here first and foremost, and the natural. You spend 80% of your time in the natural. I think that's, I'm going to say that 80-90%. Understanding the parable and its specifications. Then as you apply, you seek to identify the original intent, the big picture, which is usually how it's laid out in the scriptures, right? And then you fractalize.
Okay.
Yes.
So I'm just going to take this as a practical example now. If we were to build up the model there of the Seventh-day Adventists, now we have to consider what we found in the parable and put those waymarks in place. And when we take a look, say, for example, the great controversy and that of the 10 virgins, you got 1844 in both of those areas. So we would not be taking that up. The great controversy was talking about the sanctuary in that aspect because we don't find that in the model of the 10 virgins at the very top, correct?
Sorry, repeat that. I followed you. That's why I just. Sorry.
Okay, so both of these areas, you got the 10 virgin,
Yes.
where you have a tearing time in 1844. The other one, we got the great controversy, 1844, but there you see a different aspect, perhaps, like say, for example, that of the sanctuary. Okay, so what we would do then is we would not take the sanctuary and put that onto the line of the SDA because we have to take that of the model of the 10 virgins at the very top, that principle, right? And so what we would have to do is take that at the tarrying time, which we find in the 10 virgin timeline there, instead of the great controversy timeline where you find that of sanctuary.
Yes. And when you say take it, where are you taking it to?
Putting it onto the SDA line because it has to line up in that sequence.
Yes, because the 10 virgins is not bringing that aspect up necessarily.
Exactly.
And these are just examples. These are just,
I know, but
Yeah.
but just to get
the point.
the point home.
Okay. I'm going to make another point, which was that when we look at fractals, there were various mistakes that we made, which are now subjects of correction. And one we've already discussed, but we'll just rehash it. One mistake was we made assumptions about what the fractal of the parent line looks like. We made assumptions of what the fractal of the larger line looks like. And one of those assumptions was that the characteristics seen in the parent line are exactly replicated in the fractal. You get what I'm saying? We made this point on Friday. I'll just repeat it. And I'll use the example that we used on Friday, which is when you look at the line of the 144,000, for example, we know that our history is a fractal of the history of the 144,000. So we have 1989, 9/11, Sunday law, close of probation, and second coming. Then we have the fractal of the priest, which is 1989.
Do you want to put 2001 instead of 9/11? 2001 instead?
2001.
Doesn't matter.
Why? It's just.
I don't know, that's what we're doing now.
No, that's not what we're doing now. No, if you like it, okay, but that's not what we're doing.
That was a terrible reason, really.
All right, 2001.
I haven't, I'm not.
Okay, 1989, 2001. Sunday law is 2014. Close of probation is 2019. And second coming is Pania 2021. And the mistake that would make is in assuming all the characteristics that we see in the macro line or the parent line are replicated in the fractal, right? This is the line of the priests. This is the line of 144,000. And this had impact particularly in how we understood the waymark of the close of probation and its relation to 2019, which is the fractal of the close of probation in the line of the priest. We understood the close of probation to mark. Yes, this is Daniel 12:1, the end of intercession. understood close of probation mark, the end of intersection. So we said, well, 2019, what must it be? The end of intersection. But as we examine the concept of fractals more closely, and I laid out this model on Friday also, right? A fractal is a pattern that repeats within itself at different scales, right? So you have this line, and this line forms a pattern. It's got 1, 2, 3. Yes? Now you have the fractal of this line. I'll call this 1A, 2A, and 3A. Then in the fractal of this larger line, the fractal of this macro line or parent line, you see the same pattern reproduced. 1, 2, and 3. This is 1B, 2B, and 3B. So the fractal reproduces the pattern in the parent line, but is the waymark in the parent line, is the waymark in the fractal the exact same waymark in the parent line? This model shows it can't be. They're both number 3, so they're similar in that respect, but they're still not the same waymark because one is 3A and the other is 3B. Does that make sense? If we just add one more level, you see the same thing. This is 1C, 2C, 3C. So 3A looks like 3B and looks like 3C. They are similar, but they are not the same waymark. 3A, although it looks like 3B, it's not 3B. You know, so you get the point. So it's the same thing with fractals, right? Close of probation, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 waymarks here. Let's call this one close break. Let's call it 5. Let's call it 5A. And here we have 5B. Because the pattern is the same in both histories, 5A and 5B look similar, but they're not the same waymark.
Yeah.
Right. So as we look at this line, right? If we were to lay out the line of the priest, if we were to lay it out past 2021, we would come to the close of probation.
For the priests?
For the Levites?
Understand? I'm saying this, that the line of the priest, yes, the history of the priest ends in 2021. But if you looked at this progressive history, if you looked at it past 2021, you would eventually reach 5A, wouldn't you?
Yes.
I put C there, I meant A. So in a line of progression, it's clear to see that they're not the same waymark,
Right.
right?
I see what you're saying.
That when we fractalize this line, right, they line up with each other.
I think it should be 5C because why would you put 5A there?
Where is 5C on anything?
Because you got, okay, fine. Well then,
No, think about it, yeah.
Where's the 5 coming
it's
from?
just because
Because they're 5 waymarks.
2019.
Oh, sorry, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's 4.
Okay.
Rather correct than just chuckle over there, Mr. Trevor. We're putting wrong things on the board and you're just chuckling away. There we go, 4.
So that should be 4A then. Yeah, so it should be 4A at the end.
Or the other line there.
Yes, 40. Okay.
So the big line has no top.
Yeah, no, I see, but I'm asking why you're putting an A at the end when you have a B there.
The top line is top.
Yeah, I know, I'm getting that, but
Oh,
no, I get all that. What I'm getting at is why at the close of probation on the priest line, you're putting an A at the 4 at the end, because your example at the top, like, they may fall down A, B, C in the same areas, but they're different events, right? And I understand that. But I don't know why the last one's an A.
If you, can I,
Yes, ma'am.
if you just used a different symbol,
I would
Ali,
put
it
a
might
C.
help you. You could do a star at the top and a square at the bottom. And then what would that one be if it was a star and a square? Like, is the,
that is A's probably B.
yeah, if that's what's confusing you, it's just a symbol.
Yeah, but they're two different, okay, so they're both the close of probations.
It's showing the big line close to the base at the end.
That's right.
So I've seen it. You see, it's
He
just
just dropped down the
Well,
144,000 close of probation.
suppose those example lines you have up there, you've got 3A,
So-
3B, and 3C,
Okay.
right? And all of those would be the close of probation, just hypothetically speaking.
Okay.
But you have different letters, but it's still the 3 numbers because they represent a certain thing, a waymark. I still don't get why you have the last one as an A, like, shouldn't it be something else?
What should
Sure.
it be? Letter.
So,
Oh, let it.
Another thing, what should it be?
Well, you only have 2 lines of demonstration. You have the 44,000 and the priests. You don't have a third line. A third line would then be a close of probation for, say, the Levites. I would see that as being a C,
It's good.
a 4C, right, at their close of probation, because you're following down suit.
But remember what I said we're doing here. We have the line of the priest, it ends here in 2020.
Right.
And in this line of the priest, close of probation is 2019. Second coming is 2021.
Yeah.
And the point I'm making is that these close of probation and 2019, they look the same, but they're not the same waymark.
Yeah,
How do you know they're not the same waymark?
they have different events.
But they look the same. If you took this line as a line of progression, although the priest's history ends in 2021, we know that this history continues, right? And if you took it right through to the close of probation, right?
Yeah.
That's why it's dotted over here.
It's, you're forgetting the Sunday law and,
Yes, I'm just skipping all of that,
okay,
right? And if we just skipped through to the close of probation, which close of probation is it?
In general.
yeah. I
I'm
would-
saying, is it not this one?
Yes.
Yeah, it would be.
That's what it's called out.
That's why I'm,
Oh, I get it.
Exactly.
Okay, that's good.
you sure?
Yes, I can explain it now. I'm good though, I get it.
Go and explain it.
Go and explain it. Yeah.
Okay, so if you got the main, forget the priest line, the 144,000 line is the general line, the parent line, or whatever you want to call it. And then the close of probation, because it's the 4th waymark, you got the number 4 and A. Down below, you've got, now you're going fractal for the priest. You've got 2019 as the close of probation. It's the same close of probation for different events. It's the 4th waymark, but it's a B because it's a different line with different information. But if you continued and skipping the last 2 waymarks to the close of probation, as if we're on the general line, it's still the 4th waymark before the second coming because you're going back to the general, and it's A. Because A is the 144, B is the priest, C is, if you're gonna do it that way, right? Nothing, or, did I explain it right? I think I did.
Mhm.
I think you get it.
I get it. Thank you.
Tiffany.
I was just trying to help her, but she gets it now. So.
Do we all get it? Trevor?
it'd be like if you took your very top corner model there
and you threw some dots on your last line.
This one.
Yeah, dot, dot, dot.
Yeah.
And then you bring that first A, eventually you'll hit that first 3A.
Yeah,
Yeah, so you know when you look at it as a line of progression, you know they're different waymarks altogether. Right? They're different waymarks altogether, although at a fractal level, they look similar. Right. So the point was made that, look, when you look at the fractal, you are seeing a history that looks similar to what is identified at the parent waymark, but they're not the same thing. That is most clearly seen, for example, with the second coming, because we know that the second coming parallels 2021, but no one argues that Christ is literally coming the second time in 2021, right? So this is 5A, right? And this is 5B. So whatever's happening here at 5B, it's not literally 5A. It shares characteristics of 5A. You know it's not the same waymark because if you took this history as a line of progression, you would eventually reach 5A as a separate waymark, as a waymark all on its own. Right?
Yes. And so we've just talked about doing that with a future one. So now when you explain that for 2014, it makes it a lot easier to see that, yes, 2014, there was Sunday law, for lack of a better term, but it's not the Sunday law A, that's future. What that looks like, I'm not 100% sure yet.
So with the past one, it's easier to see, right? Because with 2014 is the Sunday law. You study the characteristics of the Sunday law. Now the history of 2014 is all in the past.
And it's B. 2014 is actually B.
This is 3A, and this is 3B. So you can actually go back and look at 2014 and say, we're going to do that actually. What are the characteristics that we see here that were repeated here? Right? If you go, you are?
Two groups.
Yeah, you can start to identify those characteristics. You can start to go with the spirit of prophecy and look at the passages which talk about 3A here, which talk about the Sunday law, right? And as you understand what those passages are presenting, you go back to the history of 2014, 3B, and you can compare the history that transpired with what is presented in inspiration at the very same waymark. So you see that, what is represented, it's not the exact same, it's not the exact same waymark, but you see that it's very similar. You see the same dynamics playing out. Yes, and that will become clear as we go through an example, because I think that'll be useful if we go through an illustration of what that.
are you gonna go over what the illustration is for 2021, what the characteristics look like with the second coming of Christ spiritually? As it is on the big line? Because I don't know what those characters, what I remember is what FFA used to teach, and that could be all wrong.
And what did they teach about it?
That Christ was riding the ass coming into Jerusalem. And that because he's riding the ass, he's entering Jerusalem, which represents the church, and that was we always put that at Panium. Now we have it known as 2021 Panium.
Yes, but you're looking at the line of Christ and the triumphal entry.
Triumphal entry, yeah.
Right, but I'm saying but that's not the lens through which we're viewing this history. We're viewing it through the lens of
The big
He
line,
went 144,000.
yeah,
So there's no triumphal entry being brought out here,
that's right.
right? So we have to look at what does great controversy say about the second coming?
Yeah.
And what characteristics of it do we expect to be repeated in 2021? Right?
Yeah.
So that's the question. So we're being guided by the model. These waymarks, all right, not 1999, 2001, but these waymarks are presented in great controversy. So we could go to great controversy, identify what is being said, and then use that to guide us as to how to understand this waymark. So what happens at the second coming?
Like, are we considering the whole time period or just that waymark?
Well, we're looking at the waymark for now.
Did you finish your 2014 thought? I feel like she derailed you.
I'm sorry.
But it's okay, well, we're coming to it.
Okay.
We're coming to it.
I was wanting to hear it, so.
So,
All right, carry on, carry on.
so the second coming is Christ, like, that's why I'm saying, like, I don't know if we put the voice of God, pronouncing the day and hour, if that's not the actual coming. We see the cloud, it's black. And then it gets bigger, and there's a trumpet that's blown,
Then what happened?
and then the dead are resurrected.
The dead are resurrected.
Yeah.
They're resurrected how?
He calls them
He calls them,
with the
And-
trumpet,
yes. And they wake up.
and they wake up.
And
Well,
how do
and
they?
there's a special resurrection first. They wake up to, and then they join to see the coming, and then there's another resurrection,
And the resurrected people, how do they look?
glorified.
They're glorified. We read great controversy. When they are resurrected, they're glorified. You know, what happens? Who sees them?
The wicked.
Those who are lifted up in the air.
But the Gentiles, they see them, or the other people.
Yeah.
They see them, right? They see them in their glorified bodies,
And they worship them.
right? Do they worship them?
Well, they bow down, yeah.
Yeah.
In the
To
Greek
those-
controversy,
Yeah,
you do
just
see
each other's
that in the
feet.
dark, plague of darkness is there.
I think,
Or they come to worship at the saints' feet.
yeah.
Exactly.
But at their glorification, they're seen in their glorified bodies by the wicked, or the people of the world, right?
Actually, the wicked, they'll actually see Christ coming and they'll cry for the rocks to fall down.
So these are all symbolic representations of things we're going to see in 2021.
But I thought it was gonna look like how we thought it would, like,
Which is
like this ensign being lifted up won't necessarily be like, the lifting up could be persecution. Were
Well,
we saying that?
we're looking at glorification, right? Is
Like when Christ was lifted up on the cross, for example, he was
Yeah.
being glorified.
he was
right?
being glorified,
But
but
he
it
was-
wasn't by people loving and adoring
Yeah.
him. Right? It was the character he demonstrated and the work that he did in the midst of persecution, in the midst of a fight
Right,
with the enemies of God's people, right? So the glorification is not necessarily a good thing,
right,
but you have that concept. So we have glorification here,
Yeah.
based on what we see at the second coming,
okay.
right? And we have the world witnessing it,
Yeah.
witnessing the glorification of the saints.
And it won't look like 5A.
Yes,
Sorry, but I know you're making reference to the cross glorification. This one looks positive, doesn't it?
it does.
If we're really going to take the symbol, it's persecution at the cross, which
But that's why I'm saying it's not 5A. It has the similar characteristics, but it's not 5A, because down the line, yeah, you can do that, because that's what we do at the end of intercession. We say it's the end of Christ interceding, but we bring it down to our line. We say it's not really the end. It's not really what happened, but it's similar.
I get Emma's point, which is that, if we're guided as to what, because what I just did was I looked for the definition of glorification, and I took the definition of another model, right? The cross, right? But if we look at how glorification is presented here, and there's sometimes we need to try as far as possible to bring out what is being taught here before we bring anything else. Glorification as it is presented here, you know, the saints are glorified. It's a positive thing. The Gentiles see them. What is that communicating about Panion? Because we'd probably look to the line of Christ, right? And what it communicates about glorification is adding more information about what this waymark looks like than what is being brought out here by Great Controversy's presentation of the second coming. Does that make sense? Should I say that again?
Yeah.
One more.
That I'm saying that I drew on the definition of glorification from a different line, which is the line of Christ, right? But what we should try to do as far as possible is to say, okay, how is glorification being presented here? And she's right in that it's being presented as a good thing. They're being glorified before the heathen, and the heathen are seeing them, right, in their glorified state. So we take those characteristics and consider those in terms of seeking to understand how they're represented here. We could arguably lay out a line of Christ, which is identifying his glorification at the cross, or yes, let me say that, which is identifying his glorification at the cross as taking place here. And here Christ is being glorified in that line, look different from what's being presented at that line. But what that line is doing is giving additional information regarding what this waymark looks like.
The cross is not that waymark anyway. So
No, it isn't.
Why would you take the glorification of the Christ then?
I was using it as an example. I hadn't thought as far as to say that, you know, the cross is actually panning. It isn't. What waymark is actually panning from the line of Christ?
Is it John Patmos?
Pentecost.
Second coming.
You what?
Second coming, when they did it, we chose the line of John, so second coming is Patmos, it could be on one level, it's 100.
Okay.
When Christ comes to John Patmos. And when you look at that, okay, he's in a position of exile, but it's glorifying, it's glorious.
Yeah.
He sees Christ in vision. So he has this nearness to Christ, I suppose, in that model. Plus the second coming, you're lifted up in the air to be with Jesus forever. So they're both very positive kind of pictures in the second coming. If you line those two waymarks up. And if you start, I see what you're doing, you can link glorification to the word glorification, but the thing that I wrestle with is, what's the point of the characteristics of these waymarks if we're just going to switch it right around and say, actually, it's really nothing like the second coming, because the second coming is all completely positive, and we know trouble's coming. So what do we get from that now? Except if we don't take the positive characteristics from it, it's like, well, what's it teaching us? But on another level, maybe we know it looks different. So I'm waiting to see what the differences are, because I'm looking at 2014 and I'm saying, okay, we drew some characteristics, we said we should expect to see some of these things. And it kind of looks similar to something that doesn't really. And so some of the characteristics now, what we're doing is taking them and saying, we're going to use those contrasting characteristics now to predict what something looks like in the future. So it seems to me there's a two-way thing going on here. I know we're not supposed to build a line on a fractal, but we take the parent line, we get the characteristics, we see where the waymarks are, we get some characteristics fulfilled, but the contrasting ones, because we're doing compare and contrast, seems to me are now going to dictate what it looks like in the future. Because otherwise, what's the point of that?
The contrasting ones are going to dictate. Or is it
Maybe that's not what simple.
Can I repeat your question just to make sure I understand?
Yeah.
Basically, you're saying, what do we do when we have two different models that show us contradictory characteristics for a certain event?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or in essence, yeah. Or if you're going to turn those, do you understand what I'm saying about the second coming? Second coming is a positive thing. We're glorified positively. We're lifted up to be with Christ. That we could get the rocks fall on them. It's all very positive. It's all very. That's what the second coming looks like. Then we say, okay, that's glorification. Now let's get glorification of the cross and put it in that way mark and say, oh, it's all very negative, you get lifted up on the cross. I'm saying, okay, so what did that original second coming waymark teach us then? Except to give us the word glorification, that what we're saying.
Well, I mean, there's a good development that takes place there, in that the priests who have been hidden up until this point, they're lifted up, and the world sees them proclaiming this message.
Trying to tell me it's good, that, okay.
And the world sees them.
However you sell it.
Like the cross is the most beautiful.
Central to the plan of salvation.
Yeah,
I know, on one level.
And the world sees them, fulfilling all these things that we've been talking about, that this church is going to be raised up and we're going to be at the forefront of world affairs, giving this message, which is going to be the issue. There's coming a time when, Corona won't necessarily be the issue. We will be the issue. You know what I mean? That is being figured out, that everyone's trying to figure out, right? And we've been saying all this is going to happen, but no one knows who we are. We're all hidden. And now when we come to this point, we're finally lifted up, we're glorified, and we are visibly fulfilling the purpose for which we came into the world. It's like the glorification at the second coming. The saints had the glory within them, right? But it was hidden, right? In their characters, they had the character of Christ, and now they're given the glorified bodies, which everyone sees. If that parallel makes sense.
I have a question.
Yes.
When we, again, it's the stuff we used to learn before that we probably have to unlearn. When Christ was arrested for blasphemy and sedition, we didn't see any of that on our line in a spiritual sense for us.
When he was arrested for sedition and heresy.
Was it heresy? Yeah, midnight. We didn't see those things develop in a fractal sense for the priests. So I'm still kind of wondering, the stuff that we said were solid didn't exactly happen, did they?
With some of those lines, right? Like that one.
Yeah.
We were identifying the cross at midnight, which is 2019.
Which is correct.
Right. And we're identifying him being tried for sedition and heresy before then. Some of those lines, as the lines were laid out, they were actually correct, but the applications we're making of them, or rather how we're interpreting them, was wrong. Right? Like we were interpreting persecution coming, we're interpreting persecution coming from the state at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And with a lot of those, what we're actually seeing is this conflict that took place between us and Future for America, just before that waymark, which is the cross. So the level at which we're conceptualizing it, our application was wrong, but the line itself was correct.
So was it
the line and what we're saying happens at each of the waymarks was correct, but our application, our applications were not always accurate.
Is that because it's a fractal, so that we're seeing our characteristics aren't the same, but we see similar events happening in the sense of betrayal and a falling away, and
okay, that I could see.
so I think that we're going to see those things in future still. Do you think?
Yes.
I think so, but we're not there yet. So because this is a fractal, it's a type of it. If you put it like that, I think we didn't use type. Before.
That was
Seems
more
like
sense. Yeah. Thank you.
Because I mean, like the level at which we're applying, how we're interpreting some of the symbols, right? Would have said those accusing Christ of sedition and heresy, that is the Adventist Church in union with the state, right? So the level at which we're applying those symbols sometimes was incorrect. When it was really talking about the history of the priests in that application, that application is not reaching towards the level of the state and the Protestant churches. It's dealing with developments in the movement. So where we would say this is the Adventist church, like the corporate Adventist church, it was really talking about what FFA is doing at that point to the priests, if that makes sense. So again, I contend a lot of those lines were correct. Our application or interpretation of the symbols, we'll put them at the wrong level. Sometimes.
It's just like the time regime and the decimal. You know, it's taking, for example, 1844 and say, oh, obviously it's going to be, you know, the time when the model itself, you know, will teach, you know, the sanctuary, will just, you know, give too many details, you know, that might be noise, you know, at that time, you know, because it was not fitted, you know, properly in the model. I think this is what we were doing, you know, just throwing in all details.
I think it is because as we're looking now, we're seeing more details of it correctly. So
Yeah.
it seems to be that each group as it comes, it's testing the group they come from. So these pre's, we've been raised up by FFA, that is our institution, that's the group that was raised up by God to do the work, is apostatizing now. And there's controversy between the faithful ones in that group and the non-faithful ones. So as we get to Levites, they're part of the church. It's going to be involving the church at large now. So now the church will be labeled as heretics as opposed to FFA. It's just going to escalate to the state when we get to the Nephilims because they're part of the world. So this agitation is just going to increase at each group as they do it together and probably amalgamate. And that's where church and state will come under the Nephilims perhaps as opposed to.
So we see the church again? I didn't know that.
We fight the church again.
I think we've always
Yeah, we
thought the
do.
church will join in that, will persecute us, the SDA church will persecute us, at least we always thought that's what Alison's saying, when they'll come together with the state.
Yeah, I just thought that was changed, but maybe I was misunderstanding.
Only because the Levites, you know, it will be a bigger group.
Yeah,
And so it will be more visible, you know, how many people come to the movement. So they will have
Didn't you just say that they received not wrong and it was FFA, not the church,
Yeah, that's.
or what?
Yes, it was FFA and now factual.
Yeah.
I'm saying as we get the Levites now, it's going to escalate to the church, isn't it?
Oh.
So each group that's tested, the group that's tested is the group they worked with that they're closest to. So we're
Gotcha.
the group raised up by God to give the message to the priests was FFA and they apostatized. And the group raised up originally that should have given this message to the SDA church, the Levites going to be called after that. And then the Nephilims out the world. So as those groups get tested,
Okay.
it's going to escalate to the group to that level. And the whole church is going to be against us and then the whole world. I think that's how I'm seeing it.
Whereas before we weren't tight about those levels.
No.
Like that's a clear structure.
Yeah.
Like, you know, where it made sense that, you know, panning to the Sunday law, you're dealing with the Adventist church.
Yeah.
We were bringing it back into our models at midnight and so on and so forth. We just didn't have that type of structure,
Really defined.
right? But now when you put things within the context of, you know, as you said, that pattern that you laid out within that structure, then the applications start to make sense.
So if we think about that, maybe we can't expect to see the state involvement until Sunday law. Because 2021 is really the Levite. So 2021 to Sunday law is going to be our agitation with the SDA church. And they may not go to the state in that history yet, because it's all an internal there until Sunday law goes external.
Based on that pattern, it makes sense. You know, that would, you know, do we get that?
Yeah.
It depends until Rome,
The lines, you know.
that's the point. So Trevor's just made the point until Rome has to step in because we're at civil war with each other in the church. It's going to be such a bad test.
Ms. Tiffany, are you still with us?
That's a good point.
You weren't listening.
Repeat the point.
No, the point that we're going to be having a civil war, and that's when Rome steps in. I never thought of it like
You heard
that.
the last two lines.
So, sorry, so basically what we're saying is that the clarification that we have with regards to the persecution, the persecution for each group is related to who they work closely with. So FFA, SDA Church, the world, or the government. Before we conflated them,
Yeah, that's the thing.
almost, we saw them all almost happening in one
Yeah,
in one space that, it was all happening in one line, if you could call it.
Yeah.
So now we're separating it into 3 groups.
yeah, into the structures that fit, that make sense, right? Whereas before we didn't have that type of structure. We're saying we're expecting to see the Adventist church coming after the priests, you know what I mean? And the Adventist church appealing to the state to come after the priests.
Yeah.
It was all there in the history of the priests when, you know, that's not how.
Are we expecting them to, again, like during the time of the Levites, after 2021, to persecute again?
The Adventist church,
FFA?
FFA?
Yeah. Or are they just done now? They're gone. And that's it with them.
They unite with the church.
Well, if we look at the model of what in turn is happening with the faithful, the priests are going to be joined by the Levites and joined by the Methodists. And if that parallels what they're doing, the FFA is going to join the church and they're going to join the world.
And then they're still gonna fight us.
I don't think it's necessary that they join. Like,
They maybe not
Maybe they
say
don't.
they join.
They're all against.
That's the point.
Yeah.
Like, you know, you have all these groups, and Parminder was making this point. You have Tree of Life, you have Path of the Just, you have Future for America. None of them are joining with each other. They're not joining. But they're united in their opposition to this truth, and that's the state of Adventism. Adventism is divided. You got to say there are all these groups.
Which parallels our latest understanding about the UN and Trump. They're not coming together in some holy, agreement. They're actually at loggerheads with each other, but they're going to be forced down this road of all being on the same side as it were.
Yeah. So FFA is not going to say we're back with the conference again, but they're going to be there as an opposing voice to this, to this movement. If you get it, it's not that they all join per se. They join in their purpose of opposition, if I may put it that way.
So on our line, we've been told that there's going to be more people from us that will leave, and possibly like whole ministries leaving with the next test that's coming. But is that the last time for us? And then it goes to the Levites and then the Adventists. You see what I'm saying? Because we're saying first it's those that were closest to you, and then it goes with the Levites to the Adventists. So is there a point where it ends for us?
The thing is, in every dispensation, right? Remember that repeating pattern. There's a message unsealed, increase of knowledge and formalization. That formalized message becomes a test, and in every phase, there are people who,
Even if they're priests, right?
even the priests, who reject that message. That happens in every dispensation.
Okay.
Right. So even here, 2019, 2021, you're going to see the same development, because right now we're in an increase of knowledge.
Yeah.
Right. A formalization is going to take place, and this formalized message is based on the things opening up to us now, and based on how people respond to it, whether they, so there are still people who are going to fall away, even in this dispensation.
Okay, and beyond, I mean.
And beyond.
And they're just not called priests.
What do you mean they're not called priests?
Well, the priest line ends.
Yes, the priest line ends here.
So how does it work? It becomes 144,000.
So you mean say from 2021 to Sunday law.
Yeah.
There are people who are going to fall away there.
And what are they called?
When they fall away,
Yeah.
there are people who are priests who are going to fall away.
Okay. So they remain priests after.
Oh, you mean after this test in history?
Yeah.
What would we call it? Because the line of the priest ends here.
Yeah.
But the pattern repeats in every dispensation,
Yeah.
even after the history of the priest. But if you're here in the history of the priest and you fall away between 2021 and the Sunday law, it does not mean you're a Levite who fell away. It does not mean, even though the history of the priest has ended, I don't know if we have terminology for that.
SDAs.
You what?
At one level, we're all SDAs. right?
Yeah, we're all SDAs.
Well, when do you become 144,000? I thought it was at 2021. It's either you fall away now before it, or you don't fall away at all. Because if you come this far, what's gonna make you fall away?
People
The
fall away.
the test that comes.
The test that comes.
There's a test for everyone.
Yeah.
We don't know that we're gonna pass that test.
Yeah, I know that. It's true, but
It's new.
I thought. the
Well, it's
one-
not. It's not Russian roulette, by the way. It's the point was made. It's your habits,
Mm.
right? Right now, the issue is habits. Are you forming habits of trusting God, habits of prayer, and habits of Bible study? Because your habits are your character, right? So the habits that we're developing now, those are what are, sealing our faith. Not rather when the formalized message comes and then we hear it and then our test comes at a point in time. No, it's all throughout this process. The habits that we're forming, the habits that we're choosing to form, are sealing our destiny. Right.
And
But I don't know-
where do our families come into that when it says mother will be against daughter and
Father
Father.
against son.
like how does that fit in? Is it if your family is
Can I ask a different question?
no?
Is it related to a question? This was asking a question first.
No, because she's changing topics and I wanted to
Oh,
talk
okay.
about,
Okay.
I want to ask a question on the topic before.
Okay, all right, so we'll come to Kristen.
Yeah, it's not that I wanted to cut her off, it's just that I
So,
So just back to what you were saying about the 3 lines, having persecution or having a fight with people they worked with.
Mhm.
So how about the studies that we had in the past? Are they null and void now with regards to our studies of what was happening in the First and Second World Wars?
oh, you mean some of the,
Previous with SDA reform and all that stuff.
yes, you see, some of those studies, they haven't been revisited. Some of those, that was my study. And what I realized, you what?
I don't know, what's that one?
I was applying the World Wars within the history of our line, right? And again, we're coming to that similar problem, that the levels of the applications that I was making, right? Like an application that I made was, I did not understand what the Jews were. I assumed the Jews were us Adventists, were us priests, right? But the concept of looking at the allowing the characteristics of the line to direct you, right? That directed us that no, we can't just proof text. We're still doing a lot of, quick proof texting. You can't just see, all right, Jews were persecuted, and then Jews were persecuted here. So proof text, a Jew is an Adventist. So this is now line as Adventist being persecuted. That's how we used to do it. But now you see that no, look at that history. What were the characteristics of these people? Because it's not literal Germany, right? It's a power that looks like Germany, that has the same characteristics. The Jews, what were the characteristics of the Jews? They were a minority, right? And so on and so forth. So if we bring those characteristics within our context, right? And you can't say the Jews are Adventists because the Adventists were there in that history and they were a separate group from the Jews. You get it? So as we bring that to our time and say, okay, the characteristics of the Jews in that history, who are the people who fulfill those? It's immigrants, minorities, right? Muslims and so on, religious and racial minorities. Those are the people who are having the same characteristics of the Jews in that history. So again, it was how we interpret, allowing the line and the history to define for us, rather than quickly proof texting the symbols, right? So we're correct in identifying that World War I and World War II can be applied to our history, because I think that was I think before that, we hadn't seen studies taking World War I and World War II and bringing them to our line, and say that these histories, although they're not in the Bible, in a literal sort of sense, they are, although now we understand that they're part of the history of Daniel 11 verse 40. But although they're not in the Bible in the most literal sense, they're still sacred history from which we develop types, and they're still speaking about our history. Then of course, Tess came looking at the same history and refined that and corrected our applications, right? To understand that, so those studies, right? No one's revisited them. I haven't. The fundamental premise is still correct. World War I and World War II are types of our history. But again, as with a lot of the applications that we're making, the applications were not correct. Some of them.
So you're saying, when you look at maybe World War II and where we see the church pointing at the SDA reform SDA.
Yes.
You're saying that when we place it into our time, we're no longer, we should be looking at the characteristics of the Seventh-day Adventist Church and the characteristic of SDA reform. So we're not making the application that is the SDA Church reporting the priests or reporting the Levites to the authorities.
I don't think that's correct until I revisit it. I don't think that's correct. I think again, the issue of how we interpreted some of the symbols, there's some issues there that have since been clarified. So I don't think so. I don't think that's correct at present.
Yeah, I don't know what you said about SDA reform, but I'm just wondering with the Jews, whether we're actually breaking our own rules there, do we know? Because we focus on the characteristics of their Sabbath keepers, but really they're not God's people since the time period of the cross. And so we're making a literal group now, a type of us, but in that history, as you say, Adventists with us, so they're the type of us, if any group is the type of us of the Civil War. So we can't make the Jews anything to do with us because they're no longer God's people. So as a symbol, they don't represent God's people anymore.
Yeah, but that's looking at the characteristics of the symbol within the context of its history. We weren't doing that. We're just proof texting, right? You know what I mean? Just proof text Jew
in this century to represent us since the time period of the cross.
Yeah.
Any story about the Jew shouldn't be used to represent us as a church. I don't know if you can do that because it's not God's people anymore. So what are you taking from it? The fact that it keeps Sabbath, maybe to link us to them. You see what I'm saying?
So historic context helps clarify that issue. So again, so a lot of the applications like that one, I don't have confidence in that application at present. I'd have to go back and revisit.
I think what you can see in the world was that people were persecuted who just disagreed. I mean, who were not going to conform to the system or didn't fit the system. So you had prostitutes, you had Catholic priests, you had different people in those concentration camps, Jews, Seventh-day Adventists, possibly, all different groups who were the minorities who didn't agree.
Yep. So in the coming history, it's not just going to be us. Mm-hmm. Other groups, other people are going to be suffering. Other people are suffering now. Tiffany, question?
Yeah, just wondering where that fits in.
Where what fits in?
Well, we say that there's going to be the priests fighting against us, or pushing against us, and then we say the Levites will have the Adventist church, and then we say when we get to the line of Mtetwa, we'll have the world. So where do our families fit into that? Is it if they're part of the Adventist church, they'll be in the Levite line? If they're part of the world, they'll be in the.
I think we have to look at the passages that talk about that, right? And see where those passages put that, right? If you go to Great Controversy, and in our next study, we're going to go through a couple of passages from Great Controversy, right? But in our next study, though they're putting those developments where you're going to clash with your family and so on and so forth, they're putting that here, Sunday law to close of probation,
Yeah, that's what I thought.
right?
There's
So
been an application, sorry, there's been an application in our time now. You're not willing to stand up now, and they're in direct opposition to this message, and there's some warfare going on with families.
It's happening
They
now.
can say that there's an escalation.
But if they're, that's what I'm saying, does it depend on if your family is a priest? Then the priest can clash if they left. If your family is Levites, then that won't happen until that time period of the Levites. That's what I'm asking.
I don't think so, because again, if you're directed by the passages which bring that out, of course, there's elsewhere that's literally happening in some places right now, right? But if you're directed by the passages talking about that history, firstly, where do those passages locate that development? It's talking about this history, that history.
But the primary one.
And when they talk about this development, it's not distinguishing what religion or whatever the family are. It's just identifying that there's various within the family.
But you're marking it on the 144,000 line as
Yes.
the original context. Right?
Yes,
And then we make a application on
To
the
where?
fractal.
yes, to where?
So it's not.
Where's that in the
It's
front?
2014 to 2019.
Exactly. That's where this is happening at the fractal level.
What if it's not?
Then lucky you,
Yes, yes.
because it's happened to a lot of people,
It happened to me.
right? It's happened to a lot of people.
Is your question, if it's not happening now, is it ever going to happen? Because it's going to escalate. If it's not happening now, it's like a down payment, it's going to escalate. I'm seeing escalation of it. So if they're against you now, they're going to get to the place where they'll go to your other relatives and report you, or they'll go to the authorities and report you, and it's just going to get worse. And that still may happen, isn't it? Or maybe.
I mean, I don't know that they're against me.
No,
But that's what's hard to understand is that
at what point they're gonna
they
do
don't accept what I believe, but they're not against me. Or is that the same thing?
That's like his brothers, they don't accept, but they're not fighting him.
So maybe some people won't be so violently against and they'll still be on the wrong side, or maybe they'll switch, maybe there's hope.
And the thing is this, right? Some of these people, when you talk of family, if they're not Adventists and they're not opposing you now, their time of test is not now,
That's right.
right?
That's what she's asking.
They're not,
Yeah.
you might be, but they may not be.
I think you're saying what she's asking.
Yeah.
To be
You're saying what
honest.
she's asking.
Their time of test is not now, you know, like if your family is no way moved by these things, you know what I mean? They're not making decisions about it, they're not opposing it, they're not hitting that. When their time of test comes, when their time comes, if they're not even Adventists, then they're potential Methodist. So from Sunday law onwards, that's the time when they are confronted directly with the requirement to make a decision on these. At that point, they're going to go one of two ways, right? They're either going to receive it and side with you, come alongside you, or they're going to reject and oppose it. And the dynamics of that time period, as it is described, is that you're seeing a foretaste of it now. In the United States, in this history, as Trump is, I've read article after article about how families, right? Because, you know, about a woman, you know, her father's a Trump supporter, a hardcore Trumpist. And she is just, you know, she believes in the equality of people. She believes in, you know, people should be free. She's not a racist and so on and so forth. And how that difference over the issue of Trump and how they view the world and politics, that drove a wedge between them. Now they don't have a relationship. You read story after story like that, right? So the dynamics of that time are going to be such that they're either going to come into agreement with you, or the nature of the disagreement, the nature of the environment will be such that the disagreement will be strong. You know what I mean? Where they're going to really oppose you, you know. But if they're not fighting you now, then that's a good thing. Their time of test is not yet. The thing to do now is to be an example, to be sharing right principles with them, to prepare them for their time of test. You know.
So you're saying that basically the Levites should have that conflict with you between their 2014 and 9/11, between their Sunday law close of probation, and then the Netherlands should have that conflict with you between their Sunday law close of probation as well.
So it's a direct correlation to how much light they have, how much they persecute, it seems, how much opposition they have. So they've had more light, like they've been in the movement, they've got more light on that level, they're going to be at a level of opposition now, because they've got more information to resist and to reject what they're Adventist already. So it depends where they're at, how much opposition they're putting forward.
So then what that makes me struggle with, and this might be me trying to be in the mind of God, but I guess I have questions about Adventists that you were in direct conflict with. You know, people even in this room were disfellowshipped and had conflict in their local churches. So I guess I wonder about that, like those people. I mean, we've had conflict with Seventh-day Adventists who don't want anything to do with us now. So I guess what does that mean? Like, where does that fall? And I mean, it's within that time period of 2014 to 2019, or yeah, a general period before the close of probation. So my question is, those people, are they priests? Has their testing time already happened? Like, or are they?
The thing is, that's a good question. It's coming down to the individual level. And at the individual level, we can't really say, because there's some people who have understood the claims of the truth and rejected it and fought it. Then there's some people who, to be honest, where they are is our fault, right? Because of how we handled it and how we handled the truth, right? And God can tell the difference. He knows where each person is. And right now, as we're refining this message, you know, and we're going to present it yet more clearly, you know, in the near future, Panium and onwards, those people who, you know, we thought they had rejected and they were hardened in it, you know, they may yet come when the truth is presented more clearly to them. So at the individual level, you know, we can't tell where someone is. But some of those people who did fight, we have reason to expect that, you know, they will come. Some of these clarifications, like people fought us about the 25-20. And I remember, you know, different dialogues where people say, that's not what Leviticus 26 is saying. And we'll be like, no, that's what it's saying. You know, but Adventists are looking at the line of progression. Adventists are looking at the original intent, a lot of them, right? And we're not distinguishing between original intent and application, right? So the way we presented some of again, to the best of our knowledge, the way we presented some of these concepts, it was just a hard saying, you know, it was just hard for them to accept. But now as we're preparing to share the truth yet more clearly, right? There's reason to believe that, you know, some of those people who are turned away by the lack of clarity in the presentation, you know, that they would yet share. But again, that's the individual level. So we can't really tell. But some of those people will come back. I believe so. Anyway. Time's up. Sorry, do you have a question?
No, not really.
Okay.
But,
Let's close that. Father in heaven, we thank you for your word. And Lord, we thank you for the wrestling that we've been able to do with important concepts in your word. Lord, we desire to understand methodology. We desire to understand the nuts and bolts of this message. Lord, not only to understand the make and model of the vehicle as we've been using that allegory, but Lord, to open the hood and to see the engine and to understand how it operates. Lord, we're in the time period of the increase of knowledge. Help us, Lord, to appropriate this increase of knowledge so that as the message is formalized, our hearts will be prepared to receive it. Lord, we ask also that these messages, Lord, that they may be strengthening, Lord, to our spirituality, that they may be healing to us. Lord, there's so much pain in the world, Lord, in this movement also. And Lord, you say you are the balm in Gilead. These messages are like the leaves of the tree of life. And may they grant healing to the nations and to your people. Help us to have faith. Help us to walk with you. Help us daily to choose to trust you. Help us to choose to obey. Lord, we ask for a good night's rest and your blessing in the new day. Please guide, Lord, as we know we're in a difficult circumstance with all the things going on in the world. Guide us, dear Father, that all may go well. For we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
For the tower, before you go. No, there's not. Good point. I must apologize. Thank you. Oh, sorry.